Hello, fellow spiritual seekers. Today, I will not speak with difficult words or complicated philosophies. Let's put these aside and talk about something really important: the discovery of ourselves through knowledge and various spiritual practices practiced on the path of knowledge. Of course, the question may arise: if we are really what we are looking for, then why is it that it takes some practice to discover ourselves? Yes, we are already that bright and luminous self, the awareness of our consciousness that does not change or destroy. We are what monitors our body and our mind. And since we are here, and we are what we seek, then we should be able to discover ourselves easily. But this self is obscured by the fog of ignorance. Ignorance is that while we are the consciousness, we think that we are the ego, which is identified with the body and the mind. This is how we identify with our ego. However, our body and mind are just processes and activities. The body is a process and activity of millions of cells that are constantly changing, and the mind is an activity of continuous thoughts. There is no little person inside our body or mind. Past lives, actions, our genes, and our experiences have created deeply etched impressions and tendencies in our nervous system and body that give rise to thoughts and desires. Desires and thoughts create and feed the ego, which creates a veil of thoughts, desires, and emotions that create unhappiness in our lives. All these create the veil of ignorance which prevents us from discovering our true self. When we succeed in destroying the power of these tendencies and impressions that cause thoughts and desires, we will discover our true selves. Thus, the obstacle to self-discovery is that tendencies and impressions create our personality, but they also create an entity in our mind that initiates and governs our activities. This entity is called the ego, the I, which has captured us with thoughts, feelings, and imaginations, and thus usurps our identity by claiming our thoughts and feelings. The tendencies and impressions in our subconscious create the ego, which consists of thoughts, feelings, and automatic reactions. Discernment is a critical tool used to recognize that the ego is an illusion and not the true self. The ego is just a fantasy in our mind, but because we believe it really exists, we believe our thoughts and thus fall into the trap of ignorance. The cause is tendencies, desires from tendencies and thoughts. If we dissolve the ego and thoughts, we will be liberated. That's why most of the videos on this channel are about the ego. If we can see that the ego is an illusion, we will stop believing our thoughts and desires, and they will slowly weaken to their ultimate destruction. From the ego and these tendencies, we are cleansed and freed. In this channel, we follow the spiritual path of knowledge to annihilate the ego and find peace and freedom. The solution to the misery we go through in this life as humans lies within the problem. The problem is the thoughts that come from our ego and tendencies. In this channel, we don't blindly believe in some God, some unproven truth. We use reason, awareness, and personal experience to reach self-realization. Of course, the other two spiritual paths are also valid in the spiritual quest. The other two main paths to liberation and discovery of our true self are devotion and worship, and the method of mystical experiences. The path of devotion and worship of a spiritual entity, a god, etc., is practiced in most religions such as Christianity, but also in other religions or philosophies such as Hindu philosophies and Islam. The path of discovering truth through mystical experiences that usually come from meditation, as in Buddhism and many of the Hindu philosophies where they use this method to discover the ultimate truth, God, and so on. Here, I must point out that the path of knowledge and inquiry not only does not exclude worship or mystical experiences, but they are included in the path of knowledge, which recognizes that the path of worship is indeed the fastest way to liberation. The problem with worship these days is that most people, because of the dominance of science, do not accept to worship something that cannot be empirically proven, such as worshiping a God we cannot prove exists. Are we on the path of knowledge, looking for the truth in that part of ourselves that is beyond problems, thoughts, feelings, that part that is always calm, always peaceful, always united with everything? This part, my friends, is our true nature and true self. To dispel the fog of ego thoughts and desires to discover our true self, we need the path of knowledge whose first practice is discrimination. Discernment is the first of a series of practices to reach self-realization. Discernment is something like having a lens that helps us separate the real from the fake, the eternal from the temporal, or the ephemeral in our thoughts and in the external world. It's like being in a room full of objects. By discerning, we learn to distinguish which items are truly useful and which are just taking up space. Thus, we can selectively observe our ego's thoughts instead of identifying with them. Think of it as a lens that cuts through the fog of ignorance, allowing us to see beyond the illusions of our ego and touch our true nature. The ego is a false identity arising from the mistaken identification of the self with the body, mind, and senses. This misidentification is caused by ignorance. That is, we do not know that we are the awareness of our consciousness. This ignorance causes identification with the ego, which covers the true nature of the self. So our ego creates the impression that there is a little person in our mind that acts for us, is moved, and experiences unhappiness or joy. In reality, no one experiences anything. Everything in life is experiences, thoughts, imaginations, and feelings, regardless of whether we think the experiences are happening to someone imaginary in our minds. All experiences present themselves to our consciousness just as thoughts arise in our consciousness. By carefully observing and analyzing our experiences, thoughts, and feelings, we begin to see that the ego is an ever-changing and transitory phenomenon, while the true self is the unchanging, eternal observing consciousness. Discernment is the first step in discovering our true nature, beyond the thoughts, feelings, and apparent illusions of the world. This practice helps to see that it is not the ego that performs our daily actions, but rather it is the ego that creates a false sense of activity that arises due to identification with the body and mind. Discernment is not simply a mental skill. It is a way of life, a practice cultivated through self-awareness, introspection, and devotion. Through discrimination, we realize that the ego is not what experiences happiness and unhappiness, but rather the ego, that is, the sense of experiencing the emotions presented to our consciousness, is a false sense of ownership which arises because of identification with changing states of mind. But discerning the illusion reveals that the ego is not a substantial entity, but rather a mere concept or thought that appears in our consciousness. Thus, we remember that emotional pain is temporary and that our true nature, our essence, always remains intact and non-identified with the ego. Along with discernment, there are other practices and development of virtues that lead us to self-realization. I mentioned the rest below. The second step in practice is distancing or abstaining from attachments. We leave behind attachment to worldly pleasures and desires, focusing our attention on what truly has value. The third step is the practice of the 6 virtues: tranquility, self-control, self-restraint, patience, faith, and concentration become our main axis that supports the practices on the path of knowledge. The fourth condition is the longing for liberation. The desire for spiritual freedom and self-realization must burn within us. The fifth condition is the study of the Holy Scriptures. We study and understand the wise teachings or listen to our teacher. The sixth condition is contemplation. We immerse ourselves in deep contemplation and meditation, devoting time to understanding the spiritual truths we learn from the scriptures and our teacher. The seventh condition is meditation. The systematic practice of meditation becomes the path to self-realization. Applying discrimination, we understand that the ego is not the true source of knowledge, but rather the true self is our conscious awareness and the true knower. The ego is simply a reflection of this consciousness. As we consistently practice discrimination, the veil of ignorance burns away with the flame of knowledge, and the illusion of the ego is gradually pierced. This paves the way for the realization of our true identity, which is our ultimate goal. Created by Elias Stasinos. Please like, share, and subscribe for more videos.